once his approval ratings kind of sank well below 50%, down to the 40s, low 40s, they never came back up again. Will Trump stay at 41?
Give us a sort of update where we are on the US markets, because we've seen drops, we've seen historic highs. Where are we right now?
I think we're going back to the panican stage. If you remember, this was the term invented by Donald Trump, who said, don't be a panican, meaning don't be all weak and lily-livered. And of course, stocks did come roaring back after he announced the 90-day pause. And then, of course, the stock market was down again after its initial rip-roaring rise. So I think people are a bit calmer than they were, that's for sure. But the reality of having a massive trade war with China is certainly sinking in over here in the US. And I think there's a lot of nervousness now about dealing, planning for the future with somebody who is absolutely the sole decision maker for everything that's happening in the US. There's quite a lot of confidence and gratitude towards Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, for calming things down, but it's now really up to Bessent to deliver in this 90-day process. Another member of Trump's administration was saying it's going to be like Around the World in 80 Days, the Jules Verne book. But of course, America is not going to see anybody. What Trump's saying is everybody's going to come and petition him.
Do we have a sense of who Trump is listening to in his administration? Because there are lots of different voices. I mean, we've had Elon Musk, obviously, who's been critical of tariffs. You mentioned Bessent there, who's managed to pull things back. I mean, is Trump listening, or is he just reacting to events?
He is reacting to events. He said himself, that there were the yippies that in the markets that he, that was affecting his decision making. He invited the cameras into a cabinet meeting inside the White House, and I think that was supposed to be a big show of unity. But there's definitely a pecking order emerging now, where Scott Bessent in the Treasury has a lot of the power at the moment, because he is the one who's been favoring doing deals, not the kind of big bang approach that we saw. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, is supposed to be playing the bad guy, but he's also been somewhat sidelined because he's been not very good, to put it mildly, on television by suggesting that Americans will love the idea of sort of turning screws to make iPhones themselves, etc. So within the White House, he's considered to be a poor communicator, whereas Bessent kind of radiates this calm confidence, rather patrician in style, I'd say he was. And then of course there's the question of Peter Navarro, who's the Trade Secretary, who is a huge tariff fan, who did have huge sway with Trump, but appears to be being sat on by everybody else. So that's the situation we're facing now. But of course, with Trump, he can throw everything up in the air all over again.
And it was interesting you talked there about Scott Bessent. He likes to make deals. We know that Trump is a deal maker. He always tells us about that. The clarification last night from the White House that China is in actual fact facing tariffs of 145%, I'm presuming had a pretty sharp intake of breath over in the US, as much as it did here. But then on the other hand, Trump's talking about he kind of wants to make a deal, and he thinks there can be a deal with China.
Well, we've had so many contradictory messages. This was supposed to be a great master plan to isolate China, but then turned out to be punishing Americans and the rest of the world, hitting everybody in the wallet where it hurts, with the stock market going down like that. And now, if this was actually all about making people feel really panicky or panican, only to make a deal with President Xi, then what is this all about? I guess Trump thinks that he and Xi can knock heads together and come to a deal. A lot of the people who understand how the Chinese leadership works thinks, well, it's not just a question of Trump getting President Xi on the phone and negotiating head to head with him, because, without all the necessary sherpering in between. And that, I doubt, is going to happen very fast, because we've got two huge superpowers, big leaders, big egos, and neither of them want to lose face. So, if this is if he does want to make a deal with China, it seems a rather weird way of going about it. But perhaps he knows more than I do. He is president of the US.
You talk about the idea of Americans being punished. I was reading some, just really interesting ways in which America could potentially suffer through this. I mean, one was China cutting back on the number of Hollywood films that it shows. Eggs. We've talked so much about eggs in recent weeks. I was reading last night that egg prices in the US have reached a record high, $6.23 a dozen, just under £5 a dozen. At what point are people going to get a bit tetchy when they're hit in the pocket by these big decisions that Trump is making?
Well, anybody with anything in the market's already been hit. Although there was this sort of rise, people's portfolios are still down, and that means just about every single working person in the United States who has a pension. It's not just, and that doesn't mean the elderly people. That means anybody who's sort of putting money in the stock market through what was called the 401ks, which was rather wittily described as the 301ks now that they've had a bit of a shave. And then, of course, with prices, you mentioned the egg prices. Yeah, they were supposed to come down. The wholesale market was doing better because Asian flu is no longer such a problem. But they've gone up. The very point of all the uncertainty is going to drive up costs, because people won't want to be caught on the wrong side of losing money. So and plus, people are stopping spending. People are feeling uncertain about the economic future. So there's also that kind of contraction of growth that you see when everybody just says, well, at least for this week, I'm not going to make any drastic purchasing decisions. I'm not going to go out and spend a fortune even at the supermarket. There's that, you can feel that sharp intake of breath among consumers, that their lives are somewhat on hold while, everybody, including me, waits to see how this is going to pan out. That's bad for the economy in the short term, and it's bad in the long term if chaos and uncertainty keeps continuing. So one can almost have a self-induced recession if that goes on. So, JP Morgan is still warning that a recession might well be still on the cards. So I think you say, how long will it take to sink in? Well, it depends, because Donald Trump's base still thinks the man's got a plan and they trust him. There's no doubt about it. And if anybody's going to reshape the global economic order competently, they think it's Donald Trump. They think he's a proven success. And when the Trump administration says, trust the guy, he's always delivered for you, there are an awful lot of Americans who say yes. But he's way down with independents. Of course, Democratic voters never liked him anyway. His approval rating's now down to 41%. And you have to ask yourself whether this is a bit of an Afghanistan moment. Joe Biden, in his first term, he never had a second term, but, after 2020, he was actually riding higher in the polls than Donald Trump is now, or even on his election. And then came the very badly botched retreat from Afghanistan. And at that point, people stopped looking at him as a potential uniter and started looking at Joe Biden as a bit of a doddery and incompetent old man, frankly. And what Trump has lost is some of that sort of sense that when it comes to economics and business, he's something of a sort of Superman. And once you lose credibility with voters like that, it's really hard to regain that trust. Now, he's got time to regain it. But people thought that Biden would regain trust, and he never did. Once once his approval ratings kind of sank well below 50%, down to the 40s, low 40s, they never came back up again. Will Trump stay at 41? Not if the market improves, not if he gets these deals. He has a lot of boosters out there. But there's no doubt about it, his reputation has taken a severe dent.